Well, I don't think there's much in the way of negotiation. I think Zelensky and the circle of people that surround him have decided that they're going to fight to the last Ukrainian. Now, I don't know what that means. And I think we're going to get an education in the near future when the Russians launch this offensive that I think could ultimately end the conflict. But for the moment, I don't think Zelensky is interested in any form of compromise on anything. And that's one of the reasons that from the very beginning, when President Trump suggested a ceasefire, that Putin wasn't going to do it, because he said, all you're doing is creating opportunity for the Ukrainians to rearm, re-equip, and renew the war. And so it's unsurprising that negotiations, frankly, haven't gone anywhere. I don't think they will.
I mean, is President Zelensky free to negotiate? And by that, I mean, in the Russian mind, he is not legally the head of the government. So of what value would be anything he signed? And in the domestic political frame, well, he probably wouldn't get out of the building alive if he agreed, for example, to cede Crimea to the Russians as a condition for ending the war. Agreed?
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent. I think also keep this in mind. We've talked about the Austrian model of neutrality.
Right.
And that was negotiated by the leader of Austria, the president, or what we would call the chancellor. And that was a man named Bruno Kreisky. He had been popularly elected and was enjoyed widespread support inside the country. That's obviously not the case with Mr. Zelensky. Certainly, there are Ukrainians that share this deep, abiding hatred of the Russians, and regardless of what happens, will fight on. But I think the majority of people in Ukraine have had it with the war and would certainly like to see an end to it. Now, is he free to end it? Is he simply under the guns of the people around him? I suppose so. But what difference does it make? He's ultimately responsible. He's the leader of Ukraine. And if he is not going to put his life on the line for his country, then what can we expect from the rest of the people that surround him? I mean, literally, he can stand up and say, if you want to shoot me, it's your privilege to do so, but I'm going to end this war because it's in the interest of my country to end it. We haven't heard anything like that out of him.
Takeaway. The primary takeaway from this portion is that Ukraine's path to peace is obstructed by Zelensky's inflexible stance and questionable legitimacy, compounded by Russian distrust and domestic nationalist pressures. Macgregor portrays Zelensky as a leader unwilling or unable to prioritize peace, risking further devastation as a Russian offensive looms, and contrasts his situation with historical examples of effective neutral leadership. Analysis. This portion provides a critical perspective on the Ukraine conflict, focusing on the stalled negotiations and Zelensky's role as a central figure. Below is a detailed analysis of the key points, their implications, and the broader context. Zelensky's refusal to negotiate. Macgregor asserts that Zelensky and his inner circle are committed to a maximalist strategy, fighting to the last Ukrainian. This suggests a deliberate choice to prioritize resistance over diplomacy, potentially driven by ideological convictions, domestic pressures, or external influences, e.g., Western support. The rejection of Trump's ceasefire proposal, as noted by Macgregor, aligns with Putin's concern that a pause would allow Ukraine to rearm. This indicates a deep mistrust between the parties, where even temporary de-escalation is seen as a strategic disadvantage. Implication: Zelensky's stance risks prolonging the conflict, increasing Ukrainian casualties, and depleting resources, especially as Macgregor predicts a decisive Russian offensive. This could lead to a catastrophic outcome if Ukraine's military collapses without a negotiated settlement. Russian perspective on Zelensky's legitimacy. Macgregor highlights Russia's view that Zelensky lacks legal authority, likely referencing the expiration of his presidential term in May 2024, extended due to martial law, and the cancellation of elections. This perception undermines Zelensky's ability to negotiate binding agreements. From a Russian standpoint, any deal signed by Zelensky might lack credibility, complicating diplomacy. This aligns with historical precedents where legitimacy was crucial for negotiations, e.g., post-World War II agreements. Implication: Russia's skepticism reduces the likelihood of successful talks unless a new Ukrainian leadership emerges or Zelensky secures broader domestic and international recognition. Domestic pressures and risks. Macgregor suggests Zelenskyy faces significant domestic risks, such as assassination, if he concedes territory such as Crimea. This reflects the influence of ardent nationalists within Ukraine who view territorial concessions as betrayal. The contrast between Zelenskyy's situation and Austria's neutrality under Bruno Kreisky is striking. Kreisky, a popularly elected leader, negotiated Austria's neutral status in 1955, balancing Soviet and Western interests. Zelenskyy, lacking similar legitimacy and facing internal opposition, is portrayed as constrained or unwilling to take such risks. Implication: Zelenskyy's fear of backlash limits his negotiating flexibility, potentially forcing him to maintain a hardline stance to preserve his political survival, even at the cost of prolonged conflict. Public sentiment in Ukraine. Macgregor notes a divide in Ukraine. While some share Zelenskyy's anti-Russian sentiment, the majority are war-weary and desire peace. This suggests a disconnect between Zelenskyy's policies and public sentiment, potentially weakening his domestic support. The war's toll, human, economic, and infrastructural, has likely eroded public enthusiasm for continued fighting, especially as Russian advances threaten further losses. Implication: growing public fatigue could pressure Zelenskyy to reconsider his stance, but only if dissent translates into political or social movements strong enough to challenge nationalist factions. Leadership critique. Macgregor's critique of Zelenskyy's leadership is sharp, arguing that a true leader would risk personal safety to end the war, as exemplified by a hypothetical willingness to face assassination for peace. This contrasts with Zelenskyy's perceived prioritization of political survival. The reference to Zelenskyy's responsibility as Ukraine's leader underscores the expectation that he should act decisively in the national interest, even under threat. Implication: Zelenskyy's failure to emulate such leadership risks further eroding his credibility, both domestically and internationally, and could precipitate a leadership crisis if the war worsens. Historical context and neutrality. The Austrian neutrality model serves as a historical benchmark. Austria's 1955 State Treaty, negotiated by Kreisky, established permanent neutrality, ending Soviet and Western occupation. This required strong leadership, broad support, and mutual trust, elements absent in Ukraine's current context. Macgregor's use of this example highlights the structural and political barriers to a similar outcome in Ukraine, where distrust, legitimacy issues, and ongoing combat prevail. Implication: a neutrality agreement for Ukraine, as proposed by some analysts, is currently unfeasible without significant changes in leadership, public support, and Russian-Western relations. Looming Russian offensive. Macgregor's mention of an impending Russian offensive that could end the conflict suggests a belief in Russia's military superiority and Ukraine's vulnerability. This aligns with assessments of Russia's territorial gains and Ukraine's reliance on Western aid. The offensive's potential to reshape the conflict underscores the urgency of negotiations, as further Russian advances could render diplomacy moot. Implication: the prospect of a decisive Russian campaign increases pressure on Zelenskyy to act but also risks hardening his resolve if he perceives negotiations as capitulation. Broader context. This portion reflects a critical view of U.S. and Western involvement in Ukraine, with Macgregor implying that continued support enables Zelenskyy's intransigence. This aligns with his broader argument, in later portions, that Ukraine is not a vital U.S. interest. The discussion occurs in the context of shifting U.S. policy under Trump, with figures such as Vance and Rubio signaling reduced commitment, yet ongoing support, e.g., intelligence, weapons, complicates disengagement. Russian military advances, reported in 2025, and Ukraine's strained resources highlight the asymmetry of the conflict, reinforcing Macgregor's pessimism about Ukraine's prospects without a negotiated settlement. Summary. In this portion, Colonel Macgregor portrays the Ukraine conflict as stalled due to President Zelenskyy's refusal to negotiate, driven by his commitment to fight to the last Ukrainian, and constrained by domestic nationalist pressures and Russian doubts about his legitimacy. He predicts a Russian offensive that could decisively end the war, criticizing Zelenskyy for lacking the courage to risk his life for peace, unlike historical leaders such as Austria's Bruno Kreisky. While some Ukrainians share Zelenskyy's anti-Russian stance, Macgregor believes most are war-weary, highlighting a disconnect between leadership and public sentiment. This portion underscores the challenges of achieving a negotiated settlement amid distrust, internal risks, and impending military escalation. Conclusion. This portion paints a grim picture of Ukraine's path forward, with Zelenskyy's intransigence and questionable legitimacy obstructing peace efforts. Macgregor's analysis suggests that without a dramatic shift in leadership or external pressure, Ukraine faces further devastation from a Russian offensive. The comparison to Austria's neutrality model underscores the absence of conditions for a similar resolution, while the critique of Zelensky's leadership highlights the need for bold action to prioritize national survival over personal or political considerations. This discussion sets the stage for later portions on U.S. policy and Russian perceptions, framing the Ukraine conflict as a tragedy prolonged by misaligned priorities and missed opportunities for diplomacy.